Don't you just love this buzz? I love the buzz. Good evening, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Thank you all for joining us, both to all of you here in person and also to those of you who are joining us on the live stream. And of course, a very special word of welcome to our guest of honor, Russell Shorto. My name is Tracy Metz, and I'm the director of the John Adams Institute. Just to begin with a word of thanks, thanks to the publishing house Ambo Antos, which has translated Russell's book, and also we have with us this evening the translator, Jan Willem Reitsma. Jan Willem, where are you? Translators work in such loneliness that when there's a moment to put them in the light, I think we should take advantage of it. I also have a big word of thanks for our main sponsor, Wolters Kluwer. They are, yeah. There's a big group of you here this evening with us, Wolters Kluwer people. Thank you very much for joining us and for making it possible what we do as one of our main sponsors. You've been with us for many years. You are loyal. You believe in what we do and what we stand for. And I just want to say thank you so much. We really, really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. Now, we are at an inflection point in our history today. I'm writing you about another inflection point and what came out of it. That's not me speaking, that's Russell Shorto. That's how he introduces his new book, Taking Manhattan, the extraordinary events that created New York and shaped America. Obviously, Russell here is not talking about the recent elections and how those results are reshaping America as we speak. He's talking about events in 1664, when England decided to invade the Dutch colony of New Netherland. It almost came to bloodshed, but the leaders recognized that they had common ground. I think today we would all like to see that realization that we do have common ground dawn on the people leading our country today. I would actually rather not have had to say this. Just as important, Russell also tells the story of the people whose voices were not yet heard so much when he wrote his book, Island at the Center of the World. The Native Americans, the women, the religious refugees, the enslaved people, who were all part of the colonial story, with details that bring tears to your eyes, such as the story of enslaved people in the Dutch colony who were granted their freedom by Dutch magistrates on condition that their children and their children yet to be born would continue to be enslaved. He uses newly translated materials to weave their stories in with that of New Amsterdam and New Netherland in their transition into New York. Russell is a wonderful storyteller, painful as these stories often are. And it is indeed a fantastic story. You'll hear a lot more about it soon. I just wanted to add a personal note for this evening. This talk has a particular personal significance for me. When Russell published his book, The Island at the Center of the World, the John Adams invited him to come speak in Amsterdam. That was 2004. That was the first time I met Russell in person because I was the moderator that evening. Later, when I was on the board of the John Adams, Russell moved back to Amsterdam, and I suggested that he become the director. He did. And when he moved back to the US about 12 years ago, he suggested that I succeed him, and I did. In the meantime, I also interviewed him for my podcast, Water Talks, about his wonderful exhibition for the New York Historical Society, in which we heard several of the voices that we also hear in this new book. And now he is back in Amsterdam to talk about Taking Manhattan, which picks up where Island left off. And as we could see on our way in for Russell and his wife Pamela, this is really like coming home. A little bit about the run of show. I will give the floor to Russell in a moment, and then after his talk, he will have an interview with our moderator, Andrew Makkinga, who I am delighted to see back at the John Adams. Thanks for joining us, Andrew. Then we will have a dramatic storytelling experience by Elizabeth Gorman. No spoilers here, just wait and see. Then back to the interview, and then over to you for questions. So, as for the questions, we're going to try something new this evening. To give everybody a crack at posing a question, we're going to use Slido. How many of you have used Slido before? Oh, great. Okay, so you know, it's simple. You can go to www.slido.com, or you can use the QR code. Open your internet browser on your phone and go to slido.com or to the code on the screen. And we'll repeat this code a couple times in the evening if it doesn't work right away. Then you enter the event code, which you see here, and press join. To ask a question, you type it in the box and press send. And you can also like other questions. Everything's a competition nowadays. You can also like other questions by clicking the thumbs up. During this segment, our colleague Sean Cotter-Lem will stand somewhere on stage. I don't know where yet. I hope he does. Over here, off to the side. He will review the questions, then pose them to Russell. And Andrew will moderate as needed, and Russell will answer. My colleague Ian Kenny will be back after that with some closing remarks about what we have in store for you for the rest of the season. And now, over to our guest of honor, Russell Shorto.
Thanks for that lovely intro. Thank you very much, Tracy. Thank you to the John Adams Institute. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Mika. Thank you, Amboantos. I think Thijs is here representing the publisher. There he is. Thank you to Athenaeum Bookhandel, Rhoda Hood, W.W. Norton, my U.S. publisher. And there's so many people here that I'm connected with that I feel like I should do, what Steve Martin in his old act used to say. I'd like to thank each and every one of you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. So, this is wonderful. And it makes me feel, I can't help but feel that this many people, that we're all together here, and I think most of us have some stake in the transatlantic connection, the Dutch-American connection, and the very existence of gatherings like this gives the lie to the fact that such a connection can just be severed. And it exists, as we all know, it's very deep, it goes back centuries, and it exists in the persons of all of you and so many others. So grateful to you for being here for that as well. So I will kind of give an overview of this book, and I'll back up and how I came to this and what it is, and I'll talk for a little bit, and I should thank Andrew Makkinga as well for agreeing to engage me in conversation on the topic. So I look forward to that, and so we'll have a conversation. I guess I would go back 27 years when I was living in New York in the East Village at 12th Street and 2nd Avenue, which was around the corner from the churchyard of St. Mark's in the Bowery. My daughter, Anna, who's now 30 and has a son of her own, was a toddler, and the nearest open space that I would take her to run around and play was the churchyard. And the tombs of many of the first families of New York were flush with the pavement, and I kind of like the idea of this young girl full of life running around among the tombstones. And one of them is in the foundation in the wall of the church, and that's the tomb of Peter Stuyvesant. And I knew, and there's a big extensive plaque there, information about him, which I think I later went back and realized there were 4 errors in it, But I knew Peter Stuyvesant. I knew a few things about New Amsterdam. I knew he was the leader. I knew it had preceded New York. I knew it was Dutch, and that Stuyvesant had a wooden leg, and probably not much more than that. But I was interested. I've learned about myself as a writer that I tend to try to look at origins. I'm interested in origin stories. And as then a New Yorker, I wanted to get more of a sense of what this Dutch period was. Why was I so ignorant of it? So I talked to a couple of friends who are historians of New York, and they kind of did that and said, oh, when it comes to the Dutch period, I don't know. Maybe there's not much, I don't know. Somebody, however, pointed me eventually to a man named Charles Gehring, who had been working since 1974, publishing, translating, making available the official archive of the Dutch colony of New Netherland, 12,000 pages of handwritten 17th century Dutch material. And he's working at the State Library in Albany. And in fact, Charlie is still at it. And the last day of March, so a couple days ago, was his retirement officially. And today is his birthday. He's 86. I just talked to him. And okay, we'll pass along that applause. And so he has been at it since then, for I think 51 years. And talking with him, I had a series of 3 conversations, and they were disorienting in an exciting way, because I started to feel, I remember saying, do you mean to tell me that? Several times, because he was telling me the story of American colonial history, but not the way Americans have traditionally got it, from the perspective of the Puritans and Pilgrims in New England as this English story, but rather from the perspective of Lower Manhattan, New Amsterdam, this Dutch colony, which was Dutch auspices, but were really famously 18 languages, and probably more like 24 or 25 languages that were spoken there. And so I began to realize in these conversations that this is a big story. So he invited me to go to the upcoming conference that he was hosting, and I met, I attended the sessions and interviewed the scholars who were giving talks, and they were giving talks on things like Dutch foodways in the Hudson Valley, 1652 to 1687 or something. You know, it's very narrow things, but interesting. But I eventually thought, well, there's a bigger story here. So I decided eventually to, with Charlie's help, and Jannie Venema, who was a historian who worked with him from 1984 until a few years ago she retired and moved back to the Netherlands. With their help, I started research on the book, The Island at the Center of the World, that came out in 2004. And that book told the story of the Dutch colony, basically this 40-year period when the Dutch, and what I argued was that rather than it being consequential, which is how American history has looked at it, if it is considered it at all, what I argued was that the Dutch brought 2 basic things that set the DNA, the fabric of what became New York. They brought toleration, religious toleration, which came because they were the Dutch Republic had this official policy of religious toleration at a time when in Europe intolerance was official policy in Spain and England and France, and it was common sense. The idea was that if you were going to survive in a dangerous world, everybody had to be on the same page, and religion was the big divider. So there was a state religion. But the Dutch turned that thinking on its head and had this official policy of toleration. And I know there are a lot of people here who are thinking, oh, Dutch tolerance, there never really was such a thing. And yes, it has to be qualified, and probably we'll talk about that a bit more. It essentially applied to other white European Christians, so limited. Nevertheless, it was a step. It was a step in what I think some of us still think is the right direction. And the other thing they brought was capitalism, long before the word came into existence. And if you think about it, those 2 things are a recipe for New York City, and not just New York, but in a way for one way of looking at American history. That's why I said that this story is much bigger than how I originally conceived it. So that was the argument of The Island at the Center of the World. I have stayed connected to Charlie Gehring's work, the work of the New Netherland Institute, as it's now called, ever since then. And several years ago, I realized that Charlie and others, the volumes and these official documents that I'm talking about are court documents, council minutes, correspondence, things like that. But I started to realize that they had now translated material at the last couple of years before the English takeover in 1664. And that we could now see in these documents the city of New Amsterdam at its height, when it was this vibrant little port. I mean, it looked like kind of a Wild West town, but with some Dutch features. You know, they had a windmill, and they had gables, and a couple of canals. But they were, everybody, speaking all these different languages, had these trade connections to the Caribbean, to South America, different parts of Europe. So this vibrant settlement, which, thanks to these more recently translated documents, we can see kind of in the way that the English would have seen it at the time. So as this fruit that had suddenly ripened and the English were interested in. So then it occurred to me that to think about that period of time, I, like most other people who have written about or even thought about that period of history, kind of have tended to glide over that period. We have a tendency, I think, to think that events that happened in the past have an inevitability, whether it's the end of the Second World War, of course the Allies would win, or what have you. So it seems inevitable that the English, and that's the way the story was spun, that the English were much more powerful, and the Dutch kind of waddled around smoking their clay pipes, and then the English pushed them aside and got going, and they named it New York, and then history really begins. But what if you don't look at it with hindsight? As a writer of narrative, what I try to do, what I think is really worthwhile, is getting down on the ground and looking at it from the perspective of the people who were alive at the time, who did not know what tomorrow would bring, what the future would hold. So then I conceived of this book, Taking Manhattan, which it has the island at the center of the world was 40 years of history, and it's something like that has a certain amount of it's a little bit cumbersome. This has a more a neater structure. Speaking narratively, Aristotle, in talking about drama, said he had rules for it. It should be a set time. There should be a set beginning and end. A set number of characters, a specific geography. So this story, I'd liked, just as a writer of narrative, I liked because the characters are basically the 1,500 inhabitants of New Amsterdam and their leaders, and the 450 men who were aboard these 4 English warships who sail into the harbor, and these ships are packed with weapons and gunpowder. And the English are pointing their cannons at the island, at the fort, at the tip of Manhattan Island, and the Dutch in their fort are pointing their cannons back at them. So I also look for conflict. I mean, that you can't get more conflict than that, pointing cannons at each other. So that's kind of the setup for it. And what transpires is, rather than just start blasting away, which they logically would have done. They had the Dutch and the English were bitter rivals throughout the course of the 17th century. They had just fought a war. Then there was a truce, and now they would get exhausted, and then they would build up their reserves and then go at each other again. And these wars were all trade wars over properties. This is the great era of colonialism, when their European powers are just taking bites out of different parts of the world, and then taking each other's. So they had just ended one of these wars, and were gearing up for another one. And so they would logically have started blasting away at each other. But instead, something else happens. And what I found fascinating, and as Tracy said, I think it's particularly poignant for our time, is looking at it from the perspective of these people on the ground and where they're coming from. So from the Dutch perspective, you have Peter Stuyvesant, who's the leader, and you've got all of these, and very much these 1,500 people were part of it was democracy in action. They were, I mean, if you go down there to what's now the financial district and look out at the water, I mean, you can see, it's all there. Here's the East River, there's the Brooklyn Shore, and you can see that theater of action. So they were very much a part of the story. Stuyvesant and others in the colony had for years been writing home to the West India Company and to the Dutch government, saying, look, we've got this really interesting thing we're doing, this colony and this lively little capital, and we trade with everyone, and we sit beside this continent that's so vast we don't even know how far it goes. We could do something with this, but we need settlers, we need soldiers, we need lots of stuff. And they were ignored. They basically got a deaf ear. So they knew by this time they were alone. On the English side, and this to me was really interesting because I knew from my earlier book, I had spent a lot of time on Dutch history in the 17th century. But from the English side, this was really fascinating to me to understand better. The English Civil War, throughout the whole 17th century, you had the rise of the Puritans, and then you had essentially a deeply polarized society where a large percentage of the population was Puritan, which to my mind is religious extremist, and they wanted to take over all of society. The other side are known by history as the Royalists, which I think is a bit of a misnomer because that suggests that they were all like lovers of monarchy. And surely some of them were, but I think it's more logical to think of them as anti-Puritans, as people who just didn't want the Puritans to come over, institute theocratic rule, outlaw Christmas and dancing and theater and things like that. So this gets, this is a very serious confrontation. It builds to the English Civil War. The Puritans take charge, they capture the king, they behead him. His two sons eventually flee into exile. They take a number of people with them who are loyal to them. And then you have this period of Puritan rule. Eventually, then, Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan leader, dies, and the royals come back, and the Stuarts take the throne. Shortly after they do, they knew, and much of England had, for much of the century, been bitterly jealous of the Dutch for their trading empire. So they, right after they take power, they essentially look across the Atlantic, and they want to begin building an empire of their own. And they see that they've got English colonies in New England, and they've got some English settlements to the south in Virginia and Maryland. But right in between is this Dutch colony, which was it was not just New Amsterdam, it was a huge territory encompassing all or parts of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, some of Pennsylvania, Delaware. And this broad territory is right in the middle of, it's right in the way of this design of empire that they have. So that's mission number one that they identify. Mission number two, meanwhile, concerns New England, because yes, it's English, but decades earlier it was founded by the Puritans, who are still their bitter enemies. The Puritans in New England are pretending there isn't a war going on. They are pretending the war isn't over. As far as they're concerned, the Stuarts and that whole, everything that was not Puritan in England represents corruption, secularism, and so there's a second mission they devise, which is to make the Puritans of New England toe the line, make them bow down to their rule. So they look to a man who was with them, who had known them their whole lives. They essentially grew up together. And they had to pick someone who was very calm, very cool, a tough military leader, and in fact he had fought in the Civil War, who they could trust and who could make decisions on his own. So they pick this man, Richard Nicolls, and they give him these two missions. He sails into the harbor, what would soon become New York Harbor, and that sets up this 2-week period that I'm talking about. In 2-week period in the late summer of 1664, where he doesn't go immediately start firing at them. He anchors in the harbor, and he's there, and Stuyvesant's there, and as I say, from the Dutch side, they knew that they were on their own here. From the English side, Nicolls had begun, when he was still in London, he had begun doing homework. He was interviewing people in the Dutch colony. He was getting a sense of what it was. And this goes back to the documents that got this all going. He was getting a sense of how vibrant this community was. And I mean, he couldn't, if you think about these kinds of things, you know, a multi-ethnic society that has this kind of social glue of toleration and this way of doing business by spreading around risk, and how much energy there is in that. He's trying without, you know, help really to understand it, and he's really intrigued by it. So from his side, he decides he doesn't want to, if he can help it, he doesn't want to just destroy the place. Equally as important as this geography, maybe more important, is what they have built there, this secret sauce, and that secret sauce is in the minds of those inhabitants. So he decides, and he decides this on the ground, that he's going to try to bring them into this new creation that he has in mind. And obviously he can't text home and, you know, say, I'm completely tearing up the game plan here and doing something different. So in this 2-week period, they're sending messengers on boats back and forth, and instead of fighting, they create what I call in the book a merger. They agree to essentially keep the Dutchness of the place as a foundation, but it will transfer to English rule. And it turns out to be a brilliant tactic to preserve what the people there on the ground had. Their homes, their businesses, their trading networks. These are people, they're now in their 3rd generation of living there. And they're preserving that. And Nicolls obviously is getting something that he thinks is very valuable. The people who were really upset were the people here in the home country, the government and the West India Company, because they had given up the thing. So Richard Nicolls comes in. I won't continue to tell you the story, but I think there's so many fascinating elements of it that relate to New York as we would come to know it, and much beyond that. Nicolls, it fascinates me because he's so unknown. Everybody knows the name Peter Stuyvesant, even if it's only from tobacco. But Nicolls becomes the first governor of New York. He names New York. I have found a document where he's writing a letter to James, the Duke of York, and saying, almost by the way, oh, and I named this place New York after you. He names it. He decides New Amsterdam had just been this little tiny triangle of 16 streets at the tip of the island. He says, no, Manhattan Island will be New York. So he creates the geography that would become New York until the late 19th century. And in doing so, sets the features of this modern metropolis. He fails in that second mission, the mission to deal with the Puritans. They're really strong in Boston. They can't stand the Stuarts, and they basically say, screw you to him and his commissioners. And in that success and that failure, he sets up 2 ideological poles in colonial America that I think continue, and you can use them to read all the rest of American history. The one based in New York is multi-ethnic, it's pluralistic, it's outward-looking, it's business-oriented, and the one based in Boston is literally puritanical, it's theocratic, it's this nationalistic, it's all about us, and if God favors us and we succeed, then that means we can continue to march ahead and take over the continent. So both of those ideas of what America would be are there. And in a way, in a strange way, they're both connected to this guy, Richard Nicolls, who is so unknown. And you can read the American Civil War, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, I mean, right up to, you know, the headlines today. You can read all of that in terms of this history. So I think that we were talking at dinner before about how little regard there is for history now. And having a better sense of that history is the only way I think that we can get out of these periods such as what we're in right now, where we are truly on a cusp, on a historical cusp, and we need that kind of foundation in order to see our way forward. Okay, I will leave it at that. Thank you. Thank you. I think that's okay.
Have a seat.
All right, Andrew.
Give him one more round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, please. I mean, how's my mic doing? Our mics? Singing a bit?
A little bit of feedback there.
Yeah. How many Americans are here tonight? Okay. The Dutchies? Ah. Others? Russell, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. First, before we get into some of my questions, how many hours did you put into this book?
Hours? I don't
Days.
know. Well, years.
Years.
Yeah. I think I'm usually 4 years from book to book. I've learned that. I try to be, at the beginning I'm always optimistic. I think, it'll be 2.5 years, and it's generally 4.
And Pamela then? Yeah, is he there? Is he around? I mean, how do you, before we get into the details, like, how are you when
Can
you
somebody
write a
mic her?
No. You must tell us.
Yeah, I have a life. I basically work 9 to 5,
9 to 5.
Or maybe 10 to 6.
Yeah.
I work, and a part of a large part when you're working on history, narrative history, a large part of it is, of course, just research.
Yeah.
And research can mean travel, and I think it's really important to go to places where things happen. So one really good thing that we did early on, there is a group, there's a boat, a former New York City fire boat called the John J. Harvey, that's now, some guys bought it. It was, too old to use. By a fireboat, I mean a fire engine with it, on a boat. And it was used in 9/11. It's one of those ships that was spraying water at the burning towers. So these guys bought it, and they use it for whatever. And I got to know one of them, and so he took us, whole group of us, out on the harbor, and it's a very complicated story of Nicolls and his other ships, and they kind of got separated from one another, and they're waiting, and they're regathering, and where they are at this place in the harbor, and then they go to this, and then they come right.
They would show you around.
So we went, we recreated his route in the harbor, which was a lot of fun and really helpful, as you know, anytime you're on the canals on a boat, like it really reorients you, seeing things from the water.
Thank you so much. Could you turn off the mobile phones? Yeah? Thank you. I asked because I'm really grateful for the tremendous amount of research and work you put into this, because we need history and times like this, especially for future generations, but also for us. Before we dive deeper into speaking about this book and also what you said, I would like to begin with a figure who left a surprisingly deep imprint, both in history and on the map, George Downing. Most people know his name only because of Downing Street, number 10. The British seat of power. But the man behind that name caught my attention in your book. He appears to have lived quite a life, studying in Leiden, speaking Dutch fluently, navigating the turmoil of the English Civil War, and eventually switching sides, even tracking down his former commander, John Lambert, in, of all places, Delft. Fascinating. I hope he shares the story.
He was also part of the first graduating class of Harvard.
I was struck by how much his life touches on the major themes of the era: ambition, betrayal, ideology, empire. So could you tell us more about him and why you chose to include him in the book?
Yeah, that's
Give us the juice.
Interesting person for you to focus on, because he's not one of the main players. He's not there during this standoff, but he was a huge force in all of this history. As you say, he ingratiated him. He was really brilliant. He ingratiated himself with successive governments in England. So he became indispensable to the Puritans as their ambassador to the Dutch Republic. And then once the Stuarts came in, he managed to talk himself out of being pulled, being executed or something, and he became their ambassador to the Dutch Republic. And he got to know, and he was, everybody knew him to be utterly brilliant, and everybody who knew him hated him. He was his own mother. He kept his mother in poverty. So he becomes. He's the one that knows both of these, the English world and the Dutch world, intimately. And from being so long in the Netherlands, he knows what made the Dutch Empire work. And it had to do with banking and finance and systems and how you support these very complicated operations. So from early on, in the 1650s, he's trying to get the English to copy this. Yeah. And so he engineers this, and he's actually there once the takeover happens, once the English take over. Of course, it's months before they get news in Europe. The directors of the West India Company then go to The Hague to tell Johan de Witt, the prime minister, what happened. And de Witt is in a meeting at that moment with George Downing. And so there's this note that Jaap Jacobs, the historian, found in the archive in The Hague, a scribbled note, which I reproduce in the book because I think things like this are cool, in which they say to him, it was given to de Witt, and it says, we hate to interrupt you, but we thought we'd let you know that the English have taken New Netherland, they're now calling it New York, and we thought that since you're with the English ambassador, this might be a good,
That's why I wanted to just intro with this, because we'll get into the standoff, but what was with this operation in Delft?
Oh, he was a really big supporter of the Puritan government, and then when the Stuarts took charge, they had an amnesty because you couldn't, like when the Civil War, you can't go ahead and execute half the country that was once against you. So they issued an amnesty, except for the people who had signed the orders to behead the king, their father. So he then took it upon himself to be one of the main people searching for the regicides. And some of them went to Delft. Some of them also went to New England, where they were hidden and never found.
And he extradited one of them.
Yeah.
The reason I wanted to know is that, what do you think of someone like George Downing? Obviously, he switched sides, and now number 10 is named after him. So, does it really matter who's in power? I don't know. Is he just a man of his time, or is he a warning for us as well?
Every figure has people like him. There are you think of, I don't know, Henry Kissinger or something. Yeah. There are these, brilliant statesmen who people think are evil, or but they. So then, just to finish up what I started with, so he had this idea of making a template of these Dutch systems and applying it to England. Just to jump ahead, in 1688, so 24 years after the English take the Dutch colony and name New York, the Glorious Revolution happens in England, and that has been spun by American history as an invitation. They invited the Dutch stadtholder to come and take the throne. In fact, it was an invasion. The Dutch invaded England. It was 40,000 troops, I believe. And they did it with the help of a lot of English people who were part of this plot. But once that happens and he becomes King William, all of those systems that Downing had wanted, that's the beginning of the Bank of England. And that's, financially speaking, that's the beginning of the British Empire.
So fascinating.
So the Dutch, there's this weird comeback, in this constant power play between the English and the Dutch. The English are, aha, we got your colony, and look what we're going to make of it. And then the Dutch, well, we've got your king is now ours.
And then the English kings come and hang out in the Netherlands when they're in trouble.
Yeah. Then
there is so much in the book. It's just not about this standoff. That's why I wanted to start with George Downing. But let's go back to where you open your book. Not in the 17th century, but in a present day. Is it CDB shop? Chief Vincent? Man, looking over Manhattan. Why did you choose to begin the book there and with his voice?
So the difference, one of the main differences between when I wrote The Island at the Center of the World and this book is the world has changed. We are much more aware now, we as Western societies, of the effects of colonialism and slavery and dispossession of native peoples. And those were elements of my earlier book, but this time it's much more, it was right in front of me the whole time. So I was just more aware of it. And where in the past, I probably, when I thought of the Lenape or Munsee people, who were the people whose territory was the New York City area, I probably thought of them as figures of the past. Mm-hmm. But this time I was aware there are Lenape, Munsee people now. They're in different parts further west in the U.S. They're in Canada. And there's one group, the Ramapo Lenape, in New Jersey, who right across the river from Manhattan, from parts of their traditional land, you can almost see the skyscrapers of Manhattan. And these are the people, we think, from whom the Dutch, or with whom the Dutch engaged in this negotiation, the infamous sale of Manhattan Island. I mean, the deed has been lost, so we don't know what Indian group, what native tribe it was.
But Russell, can you please tell us about what you said or say about how the Dutch were with the deeds and the paperwork?
Yeah, so that's such an interesting story. But anyway, just to finish the first part, so then I got to know Chief Mann and his wife first. And so I went to they invited me to come to have a conversation with them. And it turned out, and Chief Vincent Mann, the chief of, is it the Wolf clan of the Ramapo Lenape? He talked for 3 hours. He knew the Dutch massacres in the 17th century. He just unfurled and all of this history of depredation that they've lived with. So I opened the book with him to make that point that they're still here.
What did that sitting there and listening to him for 3 hours? What did that do to you?
I mean, when you're. He himself traces his ancestry back to a chief named Katona in the, I think, late 17th century. And so he's someone who has just a lot of power, this power that's a mix of, anger and energy. And I just turned on my recorder and I thought, okay, I've got a list of questions. I think I asked one question, and, he just went at it.
What was the most important insight that you got from that?
That they're here. And that's what his wife said to me. She said the most memorable thing. She said, we're still here. 400 years later, we're 30 miles away, we're still here.
Because you know what I found so interesting about your book? I read Lerone Bennett's Juniors Before the Mayflower, and then you understand African Americans had a long history, obviously, before they were shipped and abducted to the United States. But what I also realized after reading your book is that it's really important to look at this specific period, even though it's also important to look at what happened before slavery and what happened before colonization. Yeah. And you do that by illustrating in different ways why it's neglected. So why do you think that this moment has remained so marginal in the broader American story?
Well, I think, not just in the case of America, Australia, I mean, everywhere there are the, indigenous, the Aboriginal, the people who were there, and there's that layer of the story. And one challenge of incorporating it into a larger narrative is that often it's a culture that didn't write things down. So in this case, I really wanted to include Native voices. I wanted to include African voices, but they were, you have to get it through the Dutch because they were the ones who were keeping the records. So you have to try to, infer what was this person really doing and thinking, even though you're getting it from the side of someone who couldn't possibly know.
And just back to those deeds and the paperwork. Dutch.
Yeah, the deeds. So I could talk forever about but I won't. About the infamous deed for the purchase of Manhattan Island. The the story in American history, what it got reduced to is this $24 purchase. The Dutch bought Manhattan Island for $24. No. It was in 1626. The Dutch were, and still are, very meticulous at paperwork. And they wanted to get things in writing. And so they negotiated, Peter Minuit, on behalf of the colony, negotiated presumably with the Lenape. We don't know because the deed is lost. But it was, and then after this happens, the next ship that goes back to the Dutch Republic, there's a figure, a man, an official at the dock. He interviews the people on board, which is presumably what they did, and hears about this. And so he writes to his bosses this letter called the Schagen letter, which is in the National Archives in The Hague, in which he says, oh, our people have settled in this colony, they're on the island, and women are giving birth, and we've got crops in the ground, so it's going well. And oh, by the way, they have purchased the island of Manhattan from the native people for the value of 60 guilders. So it's the value of, it's not 60 guilders, here's some cash. So it's things that were useful to them, knives and kettles and things. But it wasn't a purchase. That's the important thing. The Dutch knew perfectly well that from the native perspective, they didn't have a notion of real estate. From their perspective, it was entering into a mutually beneficial trading alliance. So we'll allow you to come and stay here, and we'll use the island for hunting or whatever we want to do, and we'll trade with you because they valued manufactured goods from Europe, and the Dutch wanted animal furs. So that's step one. Then step two is, very shortly after that, the Dutch are more powerful than them. And one reason that is you don't often think of that they quickly became more powerful was the diseases to which native peoples were not immune. So the Dutch unwittingly bring these diseases, and some estimates of people at the time said 90% or much more than that of the people had died within a couple of decades. So that changes the balance of power immediately, and then it's easy to forget about, oh, this was supposed to be an alliance, and instead they look at their deed and say, this is ours, get out of here. And that, in a way, then they go further and further, and then that's the story of the settling of the American continent, so to speak.
Did you call it a swindle or something?
Well, I think from our perspective, you can't not think of it as a swindle. What I also try to do is look at it from the point of view of the people on the ground, on all sides to the extent that you can. And from their perspective, of course they weren't looking 100 or 200 years into the future. They were thinking about next year or maybe a few years. And they're thinking about the Dutch, throughout most of the life of the colony, were there to trade for furs. So they needed the native people as business partners. So they didn't want to exterminate them. They didn't want to, push them out entirely. But when I say the Dutch or the native people, I mean, you've got all these individual actors, and people are doing different things. And some look at the story. This is why you write a book instead of, a pamphlet or something, because you have to unpack it, and there's all these different, this guy didn't get the email or whatever, so he's just attacking them because he's pissed off, and then they counterattack, and then you got a war on your hands,
Let's get back to this, the narrative that centers around two men, Richard Nicolls and Peter Stuyvesant, two different backgrounds, English monarchy on one side, Dutch merchant empire on the other. What drew you to these figures, and what did they allow you to explore at the end of one world and the invention of another? You said something about it.
Yeah, well, what drew me to them was this notion of as a writer of narrative history, I look for conflict, and there's a conflict. Here are these two people that represent different worlds. I mean, they're both, of course, European, but their nations had long been rivals, and they represent things that are in many ways opposed to one another. But the real twist in the story is, in this standoff, they come to see that they actually have a lot in common.
And what is that?
That, well, from the Dutch perspective, looking at Nicolls, they know perfectly well that he represents the Stuart government. They know that the Stuarts, within the scheme of things in England, are represent tolerance, religious toleration, and they want to do business the way the Dutch do. They're pragmatic. They're not the Puritans in New England, whom the people, the Dutch in the colony, knew very well. So they know these English in these ships pointing their guns at us are not those English. These are people we can deal with. And that's what goes on in this back and forth of this negotiation, which I try to tease out the details of it, some of which are there in the paper, but a lot of these details are not, because I have learned, because I read books about other historic negotiations while I was doing this, you don't put everything in writing, because for several reasons, one of which is you don't want your own people to find out what in your negotiating, you're giving up some things. And you don't want your own people to hear, oh, he's giving up that, forget it. This is all, then that ruins the whole negotiation.
But then how do you deal with it as a writer if you have snippets?
Well, what we have is the end product, which is the so-called articles of capitulation, or sometimes called articles of surrender. If it had truly been an articles of surrender, the Dutch would have had to surrender their weapons and their lives and their homes. But instead, it's a Bill of Rights. It says you will keep your homes, you will keep your businesses, please keep your trade networks, Dutch ships will keep coming, send, if more people want to come from the homeland. And in fact, Dutch notaries were still sending settlers 20 years later, and they were still calling it New Netherland. It's like New York, we don't want to think about that. But they were still, it was still, so so what I'm doing is reasoning backwards. It's like, okay, here's what we know they were doing during the negotiations, what they wrote about, and then here's the end product. This is what they had agreed on. So somewhere in there, what is where that doesn't overlap, that's what they were kind of verbally just saying, okay, what if we do this? Then will you go along with it?
Looking at the time before we go to, what was the most surprising thing you found when it comes to the differences in the approach between the Dutch and the English?
In the approach to colonization?
Yeah, and each other, and towards each other. Like in the records, the way they spoke about the others.
Just in general?
Yeah.
The Dutch built outposts. They built a trading/military post. And the English built settlement colonies, which is why English is so widely spoken and Dutch not so much. But New Netherland was different. It was almost unique in that regard. It had become a settlement colony, and the people, and that was really the subject of my earlier book, The Island at the Center of the World, was about this struggle within the colony between two people, Peter Stuyvesant and Adrian van der Donck, who represented kind of the people as opposed to the West India Company. And they were struggling over what to do with this settlement colony. And van der Donck was saying, no, you have to give the rights. We need to be treated as though, it was actually not a colony, it's a province, which is really interesting. It was founded as a province. like one of the provinces here. So that's what van der Donck was arguing. Treat us like a province, even though we're on the other side of the Atlantic.
I think we're going to have a short break. Thank
you
so much.
Yes.
There's still too much to discuss, but we have to make some space. Russell, so I can ask Russell to sit? Yeah.
We're staying here.
We stay? Okay. We get a VIP spot. It's time for storytelling about history, and it's done by Elizabeth Gorman, who has a company called Badass Tours. Lovely name, Badass Tours. Americans came to the Netherlands, I think around 2018, 19. Her husband is here as well. They do tours in Amsterdam about people of color in history, queers, and especially women. It's very intersectional. And badasstours.nl is the place you should look if you want to see more after this terrific performance. Could you all give her a very warm welcome?
Oh, thank you. That was so sweet. This has been fascinating, right? Yeah. Okay, so as you might be able to tell, I'm slightly blinded, so I'm going to ask you guys to clap or make some noise if you've been to New York. Is anyone from New York? That's awesome! Yay! So if you didn't clap or make some noise just now, I have to tell you, What Russell said about New York, that the secret sauce is in the minds of the people, that's as true today as it was when the colony was founded. And I want to tell you about one of those people that I think makes New York special, but because this is storytelling, we have to start a little bit closer to today. So, I get out of the subway, and the cops immediately push me up Broadway. Now, I'm on the Upper West Side, so I'm about a few miles north of where Broadway originally started as the Herenweg back in New Amsterdam at the tip of the island. And the cops are pushing us up Broadway so that we can get over to Central Park, because that's where the protest is. It's November of 2016, and we're all reeling because Donald Trump just got elected. Now, we talked earlier about the inevitability of history. One thing that I think people don't realize now is we in New York never thought this was going to happen. This was someone who had bankrupt projects all over the city. There was no way this guy would get elected president. And so I'm going to this protest along with a lot of other people, and I've been to protests in New York before. Protests in New York are raucous. There's usually music somewhere. It's oddly social, even if we're there for something very serious. And in what I can only assume is part of its Dutch DNA, there's usually a small group loudly protesting something else entirely. Dutch crowd. But this protest is different. It's almost silent. There's thousands of us, and we're just standing still. It feels like a funeral during a plague. We're shocked and grieving, and we're waiting for the next shoe to drop. And I've only felt this once before, when I moved to New York in the months after September 11th. I found my way to these underground clubs and art scenes and poetry slams, and I realized all of these amazing New Yorkers, they knew something else was coming. They knew that what had started on the day of the attacks wasn't done, and they were waiting for, they didn't know what, another attack, a war. There was just this sense of we're grieving and also we're scared. And so they were making art out of it. And it was really beautiful. And again, I think it's something that comes down to us from the early days of New Amsterdam. I'd like to imagine that at least a couple of those artists that I saw were descendants of Catalina Trico, who is the first European woman to give birth in New Amsterdam. She's got like 1 million descendants, and there's 30 million people in the tri-state area, so I feel like my odds are good. I feel like I must have met one of her descendants. And like me, Catalina moved to New York as a teenager, but this woman had a spine of iron. She'd been orphaned. She was a Protestant orphan from the Spanish Netherlands. And as Russell was saying, this was a part of the world, many parts of Europe, where people were killing each other over Protestant, Catholic, different type of Protestant. And she finally made her way to Amsterdam, and she had a 10-year-old older sister who had a house on the Ness, and that sister could have probably helped her to a comfortable life. And yet, she chose to get on a ship in what she must have known was a one-way voyage to the other side of the world. Why did she do that? She'd finally found her way to what could have been, Protestant comfortability, which we still excel at here. And yet, she chose to go. Was it adventure? I mean, to this day, people leave their little tiny Midwestern villages to come to New York. Was it just that sense of adventure? Was it a longing for quiet? This was a woman from a small village, and Amsterdam in the 1620s was booming. It was crowded and bursting, and there was, just like now, it was always under construction. Was there maybe a part of her that just wanted to go live in the woods somewhere? We don't know. We do know that she made an interesting choice. She married a virtual stranger at the Valsekerk, the French-speaking Protestant church. And there's a couple things you know from that marriage. First of all, she was the only one who got married here in Amsterdam. There were 4 other women on this voyage, and they all got married on the ship. So someone was on her shoulder giving her good advice and saying, let's have your honeymoon here. She and her husband both signed with their mark, so we know that they were both illiterate. Neither of them had parents to sign for them. And they knew, right, from being in this church, that they could have stayed. And off they went. Now imagine going from this small village in what is now Belgium, and then you're just in the middle of a world that's all water. That VOC boat might look big outside of the Scheepvaart Museum, but it is tiny when you're up amongst the waves. And then they finally get to Manhattan, and almost immediately they're sent up the river to what is now Albany, what was Beverwijk. And they made these like wooden huts that were like a little bit kind of dug in some places, so that a visitor the next year described them as huddling rather than dwelling in these huts. And once they had those huts made, the native people came to greet them. Now, Catalina would have heard other languages, like even the Spanish Netherlands was pretty multilingual, and you know Amsterdam was bursting with languages at the time. But imagine what that must have been like to be confronted by people that you've never seen anything like that before, whose customs were different, whose language was different. And then came winter. Like, I know it used to be colder here than it is now. Like, there used to be an ice skating between the 11 cities. I get that. But you do not know Nordic hell until you've seen upstate New York in January. Thank you, New Yorkers. Thank you. New Yorkers are vouching for me. Imagine what it must have been like, the snow and the wind and the freezing, and the woman was pregnant in a colony with not a lot of women. She gave birth that spring to Sarah, the first European girl born in New Netherlands. And then a year later, they had to go back to, bless you, they had to go back to Manhattan, back to the New Amsterdam, because the leader had disobeyed an express command and had gotten involved in a war between 2 of the native groups. And so they decided to just bring everyone back. And so she's going down this river, pregnant with her second child, with a small child. And I can't help wondering, was she frustrated? Was she like, the whole reason I came here was to get away from a continent that was tearing itself apart? I can't believe I'm still dealing with war? Or was this the beginning of the fairy tale of New York? Because when she and Joris got to New York, they built houses on Pearl Street. For the New Yorkers, that's where Francis Tavern is now. It is now the oldest pub in New York. It wasn't built when they built their houses. Joris started making money from the fur trade, and then he used that money to start a tavern. Catalina is running the farm, running the household. Eventually they had 11 children, so that's a lot of household to run. And she's, at some point, learns to read and write because she kept accounts for the tavern that were used in a later dispute. And you spoke earlier about this being a city of 25 languages, and Catalina, I just kind of hope that she was learning those languages as well as learning math. And then there's this little incident that kind of is really easy to skip over in the historical record, but it made me wonder about Sarah. See, when Sarah was 13 years old, so Sarah's the oldest kid, the first girl born in the colony. When Sarah was 13 years old, the first murder happened in the colony. A gunner was stabbed outside the fort. And it made me wonder if Sarah was the first real New Yorker. And if you haven't been to New York, if you've never lived in New York, this is what I mean by that. People who grew up in New York recognize each other. And they also recognize us. I lived in New York for 15 years, and I can't get a sentence out before they're like, oh yeah, but you didn't grow up here. Where are you actually from? There's something different about kids who grow up here. When I first got to New York, I was hanging out with this girl named Sarah who grew up in a townhouse on Washington Square Park. She was the one who told me that if you have a real silver spoon, you can put it in a champagne bottle and that'll maintain the bubbles. I was also hanging out with this guy who was a rap artist who'd grown up in the projects. And when they met each other, it was like they'd known each other their entire lives. It wasn't romantic, it was just that real New Yorker thing. So I kind of liked the idea that that was Sarah, that she was the first one to grow up in the tough city of New York. Unfortunately, war came for the colony again. I don't even want to go into the ridiculousness that started this war, but it was attacks and counterattacks, and a lot of people died, including Catalina's 4-year-old son, Jacob. And when that war was finally over, the family moved across the river to what is now Brooklyn, in this little French Protestant community. And there are these lovely stories of Catalina in this community as she gets older and older. Even after her husband dies, people visit her and describe her as just being surrounded by children and grandchildren. Although they also make it clear that she's living independently. So maybe wanting to disappear into the wilderness was part of why she moved here. Or why she moved to New York, excuse me. And when she's 59 years old, that's when the English boats enter the harbor. So again, she's got children and grandchildren. She has so much at stake if these boats start firing. And on the Brooklyn side, they're cut off. They're watching the boats go back and forth from the ship and the fort, and they don't know what's going to happen. And honestly, I wish we had a sense of history. I wish I had known of this history when I was standing there in the cold on Central Park West during that protest. It might have been comforting. It might have been comforting, as Tracy pointed out earlier, to know that common sense and a sense of common responsibility had prevailed. But the thing is, that sense of common responsibility, it doesn't just exist within leaders. We found that. I think we found it in this city, and I think we find it in New York as well. The thing I did think about, because I didn't have this history to think about while I was standing there freezing and mourning at the same time, I thought about the blackout. In 2003, a simple mistake knocked out the power for most of the East Coast. And it should have been the purge, right? New York, these 10 million people in New York, no power, what are the cops gonna do? And honestly, it was the most boring, mundane night. As I was walking from, because there was no subway, as I was walking from Times Square all the way up to Spanish Harlem, there were deli owners who were just giving away water and food for free. I saw younger people helping older strangers. And every kind of semi-residential area that I passed, I saw neighbors talking to each other for what seemed like the first time. I think that's something that New York gets from his Amsterdam DNA as well. And as we're at this cusp, as we're at this tipping point, that's what I hold on to as hope. That we move to these big cities, we turn into these little villages. New York does it just like Amsterdam does, where everyone's got these little tiny communities. But when the chips are down and the need is there, we do find our way to come together, even if it's just to grieve. That's what gives me hope about this history, and that's what gives me hope going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Ian, is it true we have 5 minutes left? Oh my God, you can't be serious. There is so much. So let's agree that you just go and read the book. Then you can find out everything about the standoff. I wanted to know more about how Nicholas grew up with the Stuarts at the manor. It's just fascinating how all these... You even speak about the Royal Society in the book. There's so many worlds that come together. Continuing where Elizabeth ended, New Amsterdam, Asser Levy, Jewish resident who fought for equal rights, challenged military rules, Tory taxes, and demanded full civic recognition. How does his story shape your broader theme of pluralism? And what does it tell us about the boundaries of tolerance? You mentioned tolerance, and I would like to hear some thoughts about tolerance.
Sure. So it was quite a diverse community, which was unusual for the time. And as I said earlier, tolerance was quite a limited thing. I think it was an important thing, but it was also quite limited. It certainly did not apply to enslaved Africans. It did not apply. I think the native people were seen as somehow entirely other. And Jews were in a different category as well. There was a small Jewish community in New Amsterdam. Peter Stuyvesant, I think, it is fair to infer from the records that although there was this official policy of religious toleration, he would much have preferred the intolerance that prevailed in the rest of Europe. I think that has to do with his background. He was the son of a Calvinist minister from the north, and Frisian, and
my last name is Frisian. Yeah, it's just,
okay. Yeah,
tough people.
And And it was hard. I mean, the common sense in intolerance is if we're all of the same mind, it's easier to lead people. Yeah. So he would have preferred, and he in fact wrote to the governors of the New England colonies, he much preferred their pure societies, and he referred to his as the scrapings of all nations. And when it came to Jews, he thought of them as an alien race, and he wanted them out. He tried to just evict them. They appealed here, and he was overruled by virtue of the fact that there was this religious toleration policy. But he still wanted to make life difficult for them. So he would do things like, in what you're referring to, the burger right. They were taxed as burghers, as citizens, but they were not given the privileges of burghers, the Jews. And one of those privileges was to walk to do the civic guard thing, like in the night watch. And so, on behalf of the Jewish community, Asser Levy, who was a really interesting figure, he was a trader, a merchant, a butcher. He probably, I only half-jokingly say, he probably was the owner of New York's first Jewish deli. So he was obviously very eloquent and insistent. So he represented them, arguing that you either have to not tax us as burghers or make us burghers. Let us do, it was a privilege to do those things. And he was Stuyvesant ruled against it, then he was overruled. So that, to me, I tell that story in the book because it's a way of saying, yes, there was a policy of toleration, but as in any society, if rulers didn't like it, they would ignore it. But then you could use the system to push back. And in this case, Asser Levy outlived Stuyvesant. He outlived the Dutch colony. He and his wife Miriam died in the 1680s. They never had children, apparently, but they became New Yorkers.
Beautiful. Sad story, but beautiful that you shared this story with us because it's a civil rights story.
Yeah, exactly.
Because of time limitations and because of the fact that we want to give space to the audience and their questions, I would like to end with something you mentioned in your speech, but also mentioned in your book. To this day, the United States is in a tug-of-war between religious tribalism and secular pluralism. I think there's a case to be made that the struggle goes back to the 17th century, to the settlement of the Puritan colonies and the invention of New York. Could you tell us a bit more about that tension and especially how it relates to current day politics?
Yeah, well, as I said, what the Dutch laid this kind of foundation in Manhattan, and there were elements of the same forces at work in England, and thanks to the fact that Richard Nicolls was who he was and who he represented in England, you had this situation where it wasn't. I mean, it could very easily have been violence, this little incident in the late summer of 1664. And it's possible that the Dutch would have won. You know, everybody thinks, and historians have long said, that the English were stronger. Of course, they were going to just roll over the Dutch. But when Stuyvesant had to defend himself, he got affidavits from Dutch soldiers who said, we were experienced soldiers in the fort. We could look across the East River and see all these soldiers that Nicolls had gotten from Long Island, English farmers, and they were lined up, and they were just like farmers with pikes and pitchforks and things. Like, we could have taken them. So it could have gone, it could have been a fight, and it could have ended with a Dutch victory or the other. But one way or the other, it would have been very different from what happened. But what happened was these elements that were enough in alignment in Dutch and English societies created this merger, and that created this really this very fertile thing that became New York. And as I said, New England developed very differently. Of course, the geography changes. I gave a talk a week or so ago at Harvard, and I said, you know, how many Puritans are there here? And nobody raised their hands. So nobody's Puritan there anymore. But that underlying dynamic that I'm drawing back to there, and I freely admit that these kinds of, you know, when you're trying to search for ideas and how they move through history, I mean, you're never really going to do it. You're just trying to connect dots. But I think that ideology has been there for going on 400 years.
But what do we see of that nowadays? Because you've explained it, but you say to this day the United States is in a tug of war.
Well, I mean, it is a wildly polarized society, and one thing that makes it even worse is, until recently, you had you tended to have one common source of information. There was the one pool of information that everybody kind of fed from, and now you don't. Everybody has their own, so it just makes it worse and worse. And you know, I mean, as I say, I think you can't draw this line too starkly.
I know you're
back
careful,
there, but I think there's value in looking for those antecedents, because you're trying to figure out who we are and how we get out of this situation.
Thank you so much. Can we? Let's have a look at the questions.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Beautiful. I've got a bunch of questions coming in. One I think is appropriate to mention is, stepping back from this whole story of New York and the Dutch influence on it, is your research process. You mentioned the troves of documents in Albany. This question from the audience is, can you tell us more about the process of researching all this? What goes into it? Are there more documents left to be translated and found? Could you jump into that for us?
Sure. As I said, my inspiration for going into this was this latter period of the official archive of the Dutch colony, and I had all that had come before, so that was this enormous pool of information. On the English side, I tried to tell the story as much as possible of this complicated story of the English Civil War from the perspective, or by means of, Richard Nicolls himself. So I was excited about the idea of resurrecting a figure who is not known at all and who was quite consequential. So we made a family trip to the village in Bedfordshire where he's from, and the town historian showed us around, showed us his tomb is there in the church, and there's a American and an English flag on it, so there's some people in that town know what he did. So there's that kind of sense of place research. Otherwise, the English Civil War, that whole drama, his records and that wider period are in two places, at the Bodleian Library at Oxford and at the British National Archives at Kew. And what I particularly, it's you know, that the thrill of the chase, because, you know, here's a figure that people really haven't written about. I mean, they've written about this moment of his life. Yet Richard Nicolls took New York and then some of what he did as governor. But his whole life before, I don't think anyone had ever written about. So finding it is a challenge. But when you find something, it's very exciting. So in the book, I put, just for my own sake, I guess, I put a picture of one of these letters that I found. During the Civil War, Nicolls is working on behalf to trying to get the Stuarts back on the throne. And he's in Europe on the continent with them, and then he's going back and forth on secret missions. At one point, he's imprisoned, and these people are exchanging letters in cipher, in code, so there were numbers. And then so I found a series of them, and I found a lot of them, but a series of them that refer to him. So every time I found one, it would be just a series of numbers, and then someone had deciphered it. The receiver had found it, or had deciphered it above it, and the one line says, "Nicolls arrived safe." And I'm like, there he is. I got him. I know the date of this, and he's at this place, and he's arrived safe. And you find another one that's from later or earlier, and you're starting to piece together using these like dots, and you're connecting the dots to piece together this, you know, this like dramatic life.
It's like the Da Vinci Code.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, without the religious overtone.
No. And then he's growing up with the future king.
Yeah. I mean, that was all fascinating too. Yeah. Kevin Fadden, the town historian in Ampthill in Bedfordshire, helped me with the background of his family, Richard Nicolls' family, and Nicolls' father. Starting with Henry VIII, the English kings would go to Ampthill to hunt. There was a hunting ground they created around there. And there was a great lodge there called the Great Lodge, where the keeper of the grounds lived with his family. And that keeper of the grounds was Nicolls' father. And so Charles I, when he was king, before he was beheaded, would come there regularly with his sons. And so his sons and Nicolls knew each other, and they lived. And when the king came, they lived in the house with him. So I mean, wasn't that great of a great lodge, and they all lived together. So they grew up knowing each other in the most intimate ways. So
the way you write it down is fascinating.
Well, that sort of thing is exciting. It's like, here's someone who's going to do something so consequential. Why did they pick him? Well, we don't know, we don't have a letter or something that says why, but you have that backstory. You know, like they've known him their whole life.
Let's go to another question.
Yeah.
Do two more.
Yeah, let's do that. One that's shot up the rankings just now has been, why do so many Dutch people think this moment in history of Nicolls is about Stuyvesant trading New York for Suriname?
Oh yeah, I get this question every time I'm in a Dutch audience. I think
You're not happy with the question?
It's about. I think Dutch people used to learn in school that the Dutch traded Manhattan for Suriname.
Yeah.
Not true. The quick version of what happened was these were trade wars, and as I said, they would take each other's properties in West Africa and in the Caribbean, and then once they were exhausted, they'd send negotiators, and all the negotiators would decide what to do about what they had done. And in this case, they decided, there's a Latin principle, which I put in the book, I forgot what the Latin is, but it means keep everything as it is. So all these properties, and there were many of them in Africa, in Canada, in the Caribbean, including New Netherland, the Dutch colony, stayed as is. So one of those was Suriname, one was Pulau Run in the East Indies, which people sometimes say is a one-to-one swap. One was New Netherland. They all stayed the same. So it was not a one-to-one swap, it was a general negotiation.
Final question. Could you write your next book about why people steal in Europe?
About what?
Why people steal? Countries stole so much.
Oh, yeah.
Stealing, exchanging. Last question.
Two more.
Two more. Beautiful. We have another question that's quite popular about why this English takeover of Manhattan hasn't entered the common consciousness of American life like Plymouth or Jamestown has, despite the world-changing nature of this event?
History is written by the winners, and the English won. Once the English had 13 colonies, then the first printing presses were in New England. They were, and the first books were written by the sons of the Puritans, and they wrote, then those first books were about the great story of their parents and coming to America and why God gave them this continent. And so that set in motion a creation myth that stayed with America for centuries. I think that has broken down quite a bit, but these things are sturdy.
Thank you.
And we have actually two questions on a similar topic about migration of Dutch people to the United States. One about how was the migration from the Dutch to Michigan and Iowa in the 19th century different from the migration of Dutch people to New Amsterdam in the 17th century? I did my best to combine those two questions.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good job you did. Well, there were two different migrations, as you say. There were others as well, but the big New Netherlands is a story that we've been talking about here, and that's an East Coast story. And in the 19th century, there was a migration from the Netherlands to Wisconsin, Michigan, that part of America, and that was a very different. There were people who went for different reasons. Of course, they were part of the larger European migration to America. And I guess you could say the two stories intersect in that most of those Europeans in the 19th century who came to America arrived first in New York Harbor and Manhattan Island. So they would have then come to what had been the Dutch colony, whether they were by then aware that it was once Dutch or not. And then slowly they get on in their wagons and head westward. And to this day, I think it's safe to say that, getting back to the idea of these different ideologies, they are very ideologically quite different. I've been to Holland, Michigan, and given talks there, and they're lovely people. They're very Midwestern. They've got the sayings like, "If it's not Dutch, it's not much," and it's a very conservative part of the country, which is obviously quite different from New York and how New York feels. So two very different Dutch end results in America.
Thank you. The last thing I would like to say to you is thank you. Because in a time where in Europe, but also in the States, universities are under attack or people are trying to rewrite narratives, you've been adding people to the narrative or what you call the myth. And we all need a myth. You change them once in a while, like Sinterklaas, and that's getting. But the way you shared the life of Dorothea Angola with me and with all of us, please keep on doing this. I'm so grateful for the work you do, and I hope you have space with your family for another 4 years and another book. Can we give him a round of applause? Thanks, Andrew. Thanks. You can stay seated and you'll finish it. Yeah.
Why don't you continue that round of applause for Russell Shorto one more time?
Yes.
Thank you, Russell, for joining us tonight. It's always a pleasure to have you back at the John Adams Institute, and tonight was no exception. Thank you for joining us in Amsterdam for a timely and thought-provoking evening. I know that I needed it. Right now, when the world feels like it's falling apart, sometimes it's helpful to zoom out and remember what history reminds us, that we're just a small piece of a much bigger picture, one we can't always see the contours of when it's happening or understand in the heat of the moment. And it is a small thought, but I find it consoling nonetheless. And a big thank you as well to Andrew Muckinga and Elizabeth Gorman for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
A few more words of thanks before you all go. To the Rode Hoed, of course, thank you for hosting us in your beautiful space, and to your entire team. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. to Ambo Anthos, who made Russell's book available in Dutch. Thanks to publishers just like you, we get to have nights like this here in Amsterdam. So please consider picking up a Dutch copy of the book to support their work. Studies show that you probably speak Dutch, or you know someone who does if you're in a John Adams audience. So please support local publishers and the work that they do by purchasing a Dutch edition of the book for yourself or as a gift for someone that you know. We are all stronger if you do so. The books are on sale tonight thanks to our friends at Atheneum Boekhandel, and Russell is, of course, signing copies, so please grab your copy while supplies last and join the line. And of course, thanks to you, all of you here, to our sponsors, Wolters Kluwer, to our friends and family, our members, our young minds, and our associates. You keep the John Adams going, and we are so grateful to see you all here. Coming up at the John Adams, on Thursday, the 8th of May, our next event, we'll have author, activist, and filmmaker Curtis Chin, and he'll join us for a night of conversation, community, and cuisine. His memoir, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant, recounts growing up in 1980s Detroit, where his family's restaurant was a beacon of resilience, belonging, and learning. And earlier that same evening, we will be hosting our book and media club dialogues. So join us for a smaller group discussion with the author himself in an intimate setting, of course, with drinks and a light dinner supplied in advance of the event. You can find more tickets or more information and tickets on our website for both dialogues and the public event. And on Monday, the 26th of May, in collaboration with the Royal Dutch Academy of Arts and Sciences, the KNAW, we'll explore the idea of freedom, its history, its contradictions, and what it means today. Inspired loosely by FDR's 4 freedoms, 4 expert speakers will tackle freedom on talks ranging from the freedom of speech and worship to freedom from want and fear, all with a critical eye to help us get to the heart of this deeply human notion, what it just means, and who gets to claim it. And finally, on Tuesday, the 17th of June, we will close the first half of our season with Ruha Benjamin, MacArthur Genius Grant holder and powerhouse thinker, for an event at the intersection of tech and society that we are currently calling Who Owns the Future? She'll be joined by Marietje Schaake, tech expert, former Europarliamentarian, and author of The Tech Coup, for a deep dive into innovation, inequity, and imagination in the 21st century. Underpinning all of it is the question, what does progress cost, and who pays the price? These events will be live on our website soon, so please sign up for our newsletter at the QR codes above us here to stay in the loop. And if you're inspired, consider becoming a member or a sponsor of the John Adams Institute. As Tracy said at the beginning, supporting thoughtful, independent programming has never been more important than right now. And we've got a fantastic community to boot. So thank you again to Elizabeth, Andrew, Russell, and all of you for joining us. Have a great night, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Russell.
It was so good.
Also,
Thank you.
It was a